Hey, y'all, it's Tim Miller from the Bulwark, and crazy shit is happening in Canada. Donald Trump's talking about making it a state. Ministers are resigning. Justin Trudeau might be going down. And so I wanted to bring in the obvious person to discuss this with, YouTube's #1 Canadian expert. He's JJ McCullough. I'm sure you've seen him on the JJ McCullough YouTube channel with all of his knickknacks and his obsession with interesting pop cultural totems and The Simpsons and other things such as that. But most importantly, he is the internet's #1 expert on Canuck affairs. So thank you, JJ, for coming to educate us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, all these Canadians with their beady little eyes.
You Canadians are all the same with your beady little eyes and flapping heads. You're trash. That.
It's just hard to even know what's happening up there sometimes down here in the States. And we do have a decent amount of Canadian viewers that I hear from. And you guys are obsessed with us, kind of, and can name random American senators. And I am ostensibly an American political expert and know literally nothing about what is happening up there. I'd never even heard of this finance minister who resigned. So I'm hoping that you can educate us ugly Americans a little bit, if that's okay.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you've never heard of her because she was actually sort of made her name for herself as an American political commentator. Chrystia Freeland spent a great deal of time working for US-based publications, spent a lot of time like The Economist and the Financial Times and things of this sort. I mean, I guess these are British-based things, but, they had a profile in America. She was sort of part of the Aspen set, the big ideas kind of crowd, sort of made her a great sort of enemy of the anti-globalist scene because she's sort of seen as the rootless cosmopolitan extraordinaire. But anyway, for that reason, she was a very high-profile get for Prime Minister Trudeau when he made her foreign minister and then most recently finance minister. She was supposedly brought a lot of sort of star power to his cabinet. And so the fact that she quit under sort of threat of being fired by the Prime Minister yesterday was why this was sort of such an explosive development. She was also Deputy Prime Minister, which is sort of an additional kind of meaningless title that high-profile cabinet ministers get. But, Trudeau has had a tense relationship with a lot of his finance ministers. And, one of the reasons why Trudeau is so terribly unpopular right now, a poll came out today suggesting that the number of Canadians that want to see him reelected to a fourth term is 11%. One of the reasons why his numbers are so rock bottom is because his fiscal record has, really sort of hung around his neck in a negative way. The Canadian economy is not in great shape. We've had a sort of long period of stagnant growth. Wages have not kept up with inflation. The legacy of inflation lasted longer here than it did in the States. Unemployment remains high. So there's a lot of sort of economic sort of problems in addition to sort of out of control spending that's led to a very dramatic a deficit that's far higher than Trudeau ever promised, which is what Minister Freeland was supposed to reveal to the public yesterday. She was supposed to sort of unveil this horribly gigantic $60 billion deficit. But, instead she quit. She said that she doesn't really have faith in the Prime Minister's economic leadership. And this sort of went off like a bomb. It really just makes it seem like Trudeau really has very few allies in his corner, that Trudeau's own party has very little faith in his leadership. So it's just one more sort of reminder that this is a government with sort of one foot in the proverbial political grave. And, the clock is just ticking until he loses his bid for a fourth term.
All right. I want to get back to Freeland, particularly the part that she was an American media personality, because now I'm starting to imagine in my head, daydream about maybe I might have a future as a Canadian minister of some kind, given the fascination with American media personalities. But before we get into this, the details, what happened there and the Trump, kind of the weird Trump bleat about this resignation and the Trump-Trudeau dance, I just for people that haven't been following what's happening up there closely enough, that some of the stuff you just said might be a surprise. So Trudeau is at 11%. Right? Canada has this reputation as being liberal. I mean, Trudeau's been there forever. So his unpopularity, is it just based around inflation? Are there other ways in which he's unpopular? I had a Canadian come up to me in the airport recently and say that they're very worried about a mini Trump emerging in Canada. Is that possible? Is that overstated? So I'm just curious, for a basic poli-sci 101, Trudeau is unpopular. You obviously do elections differently in Canada. what is the political landscape if you were to resign, or if there were snap elections to come, like who would be the options to replace him? Is there a Canadian Trump lurking? Like, give us just the 101 basics on the political state of play right now.
Well, the political state of play. So Trudeau was elected in 2015, unseating a Conservative government. He was a bit of a political neophyte. Trudeau did not have a long political career. I mean, your older viewers might know that Justin Trudeau is the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was prime minister for 15 years, was this very sort of domineering figure in Canadian politics for a very long time. And, Trudeau, as a young man, was a bit of a sort of political dilettante. He's obviously very sort of handsome and charismatic, and he sort of rode that to his first term in 2015, sort of promising, the famous line was, sunny ways, much more sort of progressive, forward-looking government than the one that we had previously had. And, then he was reelected to a second term in 2019, and then he was elected to a third term in 2021, a sort of COVID era election that, he used his prime ministerial powers, which is a weird power that they have in the Canadian system, to call an early election. He said it was vital that we have an election sort of to deal with the future of COVID, which is one of the reasons why people are saying that we should have an early election now to deal with sort of the Trump threat. But anyway, the point is that as Trudeau has, been elected and reelected, I think that like any sort of incumbent government, people are starting to get a little sick of him. He was elected in a different political context than the one we sort of face ourselves in now. I think there's a kind of sense that Trudeau has achieved a lot of his marquee promises, very few of which ever had to do much with economic management. But obviously, sort of post-COVID, his numbers have never recovered because, this was a crisis that I think his political skill set was never particularly equipped to deal with. And as the Canadian economy has dealt with the aftermath of sort of the COVID era recession and has never really fully recovered, and it doesn't seem like this government has much of a strategy for, pulling us out of it, his numbers have accordingly declined. And this has overlapped with the Conservative Party, which lost 3 elections in a row to Trudeau, has a new candidate for prime minister, Pierre Poilievre, who is quite popular with Canadians in a way that the previous 3 Conservative candidates were not. Pierre Poilievre is a somewhat sort of pugilistic, populist kind of character. I mean, I don't think that, there's a one-to-one analogy with Trump, but, certainly he has some aspects that are probably somewhat
Does he have hats that say MCGA?
There are actually people that have, not Pierre's people, but there are sort of people in Canada that are trying to make Canada great again, a slogan and this sort of thing. I mean, Trudeau's people actually use that as a slur against Pierre.
Sure.
Because I think that Pierre's popularity is such, that, the Liberal Party, Trudeau's Liberal Party, is really quite desperate for anything to kind of curb his momentum. If there was an election held today, the polls suggest that Pierre Poilievre might win the largest landslide in Canadian political history. So he's really sort of got the wind at his back. But, it is...
So when would the actual elections be? Like, when is it? When
it's
is
supposed to be
election? And
So it's supposed to be in October of 2025. So it's still quite a ways away, right? But
is there a natural successor to Trudeau in the Liberal side of the party if he decided to step aside and pass the torch, as we said down here?
Well, I mean, it would have been, I think, Chrystia Freeland. It still might be Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister. I mean, I think she is still popular with the Liberal base. There was a sort of story that, the Liberal Party had a kind of closed door conference meeting yesterday in Ottawa. And apparently when, former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland sort of strides in, she gets a rounding sort of standing O. So I think that she had the guts to do something.
Like, where do those meetings happen? Is it like a moose lodge?
No, in an igloo, of course, right? So yes, which we go to by our dog sleds. And no, but so like I think there is a sense that, Chrystia Freeland had sort of the guts to do something that a lot of politicians in Trudeau's party have not had the guts to do, which is sort of like kind of call him out to his face, saying this government is on the wrong path economically. We need to have sort of a better sort of fiscal plan in order to sort of repair our reputation with Canadians and so forth. And so I do think that if he was to step down, she would probably be, one of the front runners. But, there's other sort of cabinet people
But then is she more of like, would you describe her, as more centrist? Is she more of like is it a Tony Blair, kind of Bill Clinton era move to neoliberalism, or is it not even like, is it just more provincial kind of differences that don't really map onto global political, whatever, ideological trends.
Well, I mean, you hit on something that I think is actually quite important, which is the idea that Chrystia Freeland is sort of being celebrated as this great hero, a woman who sort of stood up for sort of fiscal sense in the face of a Trudeau government that's doing all sorts of irresponsible things. But that said, she was finance minister for quite a while. I mean, she was very much the
Kamala issue here.
Yeah, precisely, absolutely. Yeah. I think there's actually a lot of analogies between Biden and Kamala and the situation that Trudeau is going through right now. Right? Could we scrape up any cabinet minister who could, lag a party or sort of revive a party that's at 11%? There's also the case where it's, in the Canadian system, for some reason, we don't tend, when an incumbent government sort of steps aside, or when an incumbent prime minister steps aside, he doesn't just do what Biden did and sort of say, I'm going to opt out of the race. No, what the incumbent prime ministers tend to do in Canada is they opt out of the prime ministership altogether. So this would be like the equivalent if Biden resigned the presidency and then Kamala was running as incumbent president, right? For some reason, that's how it is in Canada. I don't like this tradition. I think that it doesn't even make sense politically, because people, in the same way people resented Kamala for being, quote unquote, an unelected candidate, people resent someone who's an unelected prime minister who's running for re-election when they were never elected to that term in the first place. And so I mean, my just general sense is that this party is kind of done. They're just trying to delay the inevitable. There's gimmicky things they can do. But I mean, it's basically, I think that the best thing they can do is just pull the bandage off. Like I said earlier, Trudeau has the power to call an early election. If he called an early election, he could run for the fourth term that he says he wants to do. He could give it his best shot, and he could lose with dignity, because the alternative is to just continue this drama going on for months and months and months and months, making him just more and more unpopular, continuing to poison what remains of his legacy.
All right. So I want to get to Trump, but one more thing on this that is confusing to some of us down in the States, which is, what is who is this conservative candidate appealing to, right? Is there a populist conservative strain in Canadian politics that is kind of emerging, as we've seen in other countries, where there's interest in this, and that there is a pivot in Canada to having maybe a more of a populist conservative future, or is this just people are so unhappy with the status quo and this other guy is the guy that's there?
I think it's much more the latter. I think that I was thinking about this today when I was walking around before I did this. I think that the American political situation has kind of scrambled a lot of our brains in ways that are kind of difficult to recover from. And I think one of the ways that it's kind of scrambled our collective brains is that we've kind of assumed that the political right is always wrong about everything, right? And that the political left is kind of or at least the sort of incumbent sort of center-left party is always right, and is kind of a sort of saintly party versus a sinister party. And I often hear Americans sort of say oh, I wish we could get back to normal politics like you guys have in Canada. I hate sort of American politics. It's become so chaotic and insane. But the fact is that in normal politics, you sometimes just have to deal with normal bread and butter sort of economic matters. Yeah. And I think just the objective reality is that Justin Trudeau has not been a particularly great prime minister, has not been particularly great on the economic management of this country. I think he's been much worse than, say, President Biden has been during his 4 years, right? And so I think we just kind of have to make peace with that, and Americans as well, is that the Biden to Trudeau analogy is not one-to-one, and that Pierre's rise is not simply a sort of equivalent that there's some sort of mass kind of right-wing reactionary MAGA-esque movement sweeping Canada. I think it's just as simple as that Trudeau has not been that great at his job, and that there's a lot of momentum behind someone who's promising an alternative, even though this is a just kind of very conventional, boring, fiscal conservative versus fiscal progressive kind of clash of visions. And I think Trudeau...
You don't think that there's a big anti-woke groundswell about...
Oh, I think that's part of it, absolutely. But I'm sort of saying that I think that, Pierre's rise to the prime ministership is a kind of somewhat less interesting political phenomenon, and more sort of the equivalent of, an Obama-Romney type election.
Interesting. Okay. So I want to understand the Trump relationship here really quick, since this is an American channel. And I don't know if you've had to file anything to come. I guess we're not paying you, so you don't have to, we don't have to make sure there's any cross-border trade issues developing. But Trump wrote this: The great state of Canada is stunned as the finance minister resigns or was fired from her position by Governor Justin Trudeau. It's a funny joke there about how Canada's a state. He goes on, her behavior was totally toxic and not at all conducive to making deals, which are good for the very unhappy citizens of Canada. She will not be missed. So to me, this is kind of like, so is Trudeau trying to deal with his domestic issues by buddying up, I don't know, by like kind of acting like he's going to make a deal with Trump, and then she is acting against that? Or is this just such an American centric view of things? What is the politics of this little trade dispute that is happening?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it will not shock you, Tim, for me to say that I don't think Trump knows at all what he's talking about in that particular fleet. I mean, because like in theory, like Chrystia Freeland was fired or like left because she wasn't like left wing enough. So it doesn't make sense that Trudeau would sort of be instinctively sympathizing with Trudeau in this position. Like Trudeau, I mean, Trump, in theory, if
Trump is instinctively sympathizing with Trudeau because Trudeau came and met with him, and that's all Trump actually cares about, is that people like are nice to him and like rub his belly because his father didn't hug him.
I guess so. Although that doesn't explain why Trump also feels the need to constantly call him Governor Trudeau. I mean, Trump like clearly is very pleased with himself, because I think he has just recently learned that Canadians often have this kind of like delicate sensitivity about being seen as, you know, wannabe Americans or people that, you know, are indistinguishable from Americans. So like Trump now is like really sort of pleased with himself and gets a rise out of constantly using this line about the 51st state and Governor Trudeau and all of that. But yeah, I mean, like obviously Trump has promised to impose tariffs on Canada on day one. This is something that looms very large in sort of the Canadian, news right now. And Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, brought this up as one of the reasons why she doesn't have faith in Trudeau's economic management, that she sort of thinks that this is a sort of existential threat to the Canadian economy and is not being sort of treated as such. Instead, Trudeau is doing like sort of gimmicky tax breaks and things like that. So it's a very sort of serious crisis. I mean, I do think that despite their ideological differences, Trudeau and Trump got along relatively well during Trump's first term. You know, they did renegotiate NAFTA. Chrystia Freeland was was foreign minister during those days, and I think had a productive relationship with Rex Tillerson, if we remember him. So, you know, like it's not without. But the what's changed though is I do think that Trump has become much more radicalized against Trudeau because of the influence of people like Tucker and Elon Musk and Trump's actually new national security advisor, who has tweeted a number of like very explicitly anti-Trudeau things, pro-Pierre things. I think that sort of the MAGA world understands Trudeau in a more ideological way and sees him sort of like contiguous with sort of the American left in a way they didn't before. And, you know, as dopey as a lot of these MAGA people are, I think that they can read the headlines and they understand that Trudeau has one foot in the grave and that they're likely to get a conservative who will be much more ideologically sympathetic to them in just a few months. And I think it's not irrational for them to just have a view where they can wait Trudeau out and they don't really have an incentive to make a deal with him if someone better is coming in their mind.
Isn't the conservative side, though, in Canada worried about the tariffs? And additional tariffs are not going to be good for Canada. And so if you are coming in to the prime ministership as an ostensibly conservative and you're supposed to be having this good relationship with Trump, but Trump is imposing these tariffs, which are going to be crippling for Canada, like, isn't that a bit of a briar patch for the conservatives in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, it's like nobody in Canada is in favor of Trump imposing tariffs on Canada. I mean, let's be clear about that. But I think the idea, like sort of rhetorically, the way it will play politically is that Pierre will just kind of say, like, you know, Trump or sort of Trudeau has mismanaged the relationship with Trump the way he's mismanaged everything. Like, I'll be a fight for Canada's interests. You know, Trump will take me seriously. We'll have a good relationship, which I do think is probably true. Like, you can imagine Pierre picking up the phone the day after he's elected prime minister and being like, hey, Trump, how's it going? Like, we're sure great that we got rid of that woke, you know, moron. And now we can like both focus on making this continent great. And like it, you know, you might not want to hear that as an American, but, you know, just from a purely sort of self-interested Canadian perspective, I think it's.
Well, no, the point then is that like, this is all fake. It's all wrestling. And like, you know, if somebody comes in and is like, yeah, we're going to shut the illegals down off the northern border and you can have a press conference. And it's all that yesterday there's this Yoshi's son, the SoftBank guy that goes and has a press conference with Trump. It's like, I'm going to invest $100 billion in America. And SoftBank CEO is not making their investment decisions based on the election result. Like they were going to invest in America based on their, doing what is right for shareholders, but they know that Trump likes this, and so maybe the notion here is that the little brother Canadian can go and like have a press conference with him where Trump feels like he's a winner, and then not actually do the tariffs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you make a fair point. The degree to which sort of foreign policy in a second Trump term is going to be defined a lot by, world leaders' sort of ability to play into Trump's fantasies about how the world works and to flatter him and to sort of, play into his narratives about how things are. And again,
where is this Canadian anti-Americanism, JJ? Why cannot somebody gain some political steam in Canada by being like, fuck this guy? Fuck this guy calling us the 51st state. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's an idiot. He wants to tariff us. Canadians are great. We don't need Trump. We don't need to go down and do a little dance for him in Mar-a-Lago. Like, we've got a great country here. We log. We have Mounties. We have natural resources. Why isn't there some political hay to be made there?
I mean, anti-Americanism is a powerful force in Canadian politics, no doubt. But, so is trade with America. I mean, Canada basically does all of it.
Exaggerate your accent, really focus on the about words, or like talking French Canadian.
Canada does basically all of its trade with America. Canada does more trade with the US than every other country put together. It's upwards like 80, something in the high 80s is the trade that we do with the US. So it is very existential, and there is no alternative. It has been tried for decades and decades and decades. As long as Canada has been a country, there has been this persistent insecurity about how trade dependent we are with the United States and trying to trade more with, England or Europe or South America or wherever. But it never works because, you look at a map, the north to south sort of axis is the most logical sort of route to pass goods. And the Canadian and the US economy are so deeply integrated that we already sort of basically function as a single economic zone. The idea of imposing tariffs on Canada is like imposing tariffs on New York or California or something. It's completely economically irrational. And, traditionally, this relationship has been considered sacred by Canadians and Americans alike, just regardless of what their ideological sort of predilections are. Maintaining good sort of free flow of goods with Canada is always been uncontentious until now. So this is just, I think, one more example of a way in which, Trump is, just upending the apple cart.
I'm feeling very culturally disconnected from the Canadians with all this amiability. It's like, I want some anger. I want some edge. All right. The other thing that you said, you did a video on this yesterday, which people should go watch, which is even more in the weeds than this for the super nerds out there. But there was one element of it I just wanted to follow up on before I lost you, and that is, so you mentioned the trade. There's the NAFTA and then the USMCA that Trump renegotiated, which is between the three North American countries, and I guess there's some now interest in rejiggering that and just having a bilateral trade agreement between Canada and the U.S. Talk about that and the political implications of that conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. Yeah, we in the old days, in the 80s, in 1989, we negotiated free trade between Canada and the U.S. Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney. This was a very big deal, very contentious, but it passed, and then it became a subject of sort of like broad bipartisan consensus.
Excuse me, it was HW by 89 to close the deal.
Yeah, I guess to close the deal, it
was HW that came in and closed that deal. All right, let's not take anything away from Poppy Bush, but go ahead, continue, JJ.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, so it had been a controversial idea in Canada just because of anti-Americanism, but then it became, it yielded great economic growth for Canada and became a bipartisan kind of thing. And then sort of in the early 90s, we expanded that relationship into NAFTA, which I think was really the first time that Americans paid much attention to this. And of course, NAFTA then became defined in the American imagination, not by the, successful Canada-US dimension of it, but rather the Mexican-US dimension of it. And it sort of became sort of bound up in all this populist anger about, the giant sucking sound and outsourcing and all that. And also now, I think, in the rise of Trump, sort of Mexican-U.S. economic relations have become very bound up in like the border and drugs and crime and all that kind of thing. And so I think there is a kind of like growing sense in Canada that, Canada's economic interests should not be tied up in this American-Mexican drama that Canada has nothing to do with, right? Like if Trump seeks to sort of punish the NAFTA members, which in Trump's mind means Mexico, but inflicts collateral damage on Canada because he's pissed off at the border or whatever, like what is Canada getting out of this? You know, there was a sort of thinking that I think Mexico would grow into a much more important trade partner for Canada than it has. Canada still does very little trade with Mexico, certainly relative to our trade with the US. So there's just kind of a thinking that's like, let Mexico and America have their own trade relationship. Let Canada and the US have our own trade relationship as we did in the 80s. It's not, I think that's a persuasive argument that would make it possible for Canada to get things that you could never imagine a Trump administration, or I think even any American administration giving to Mexico, such as a thing that I'm quite passionate about, which would be to create free mobility of labor between Canada and the US, to let Canadians and Americans live and work in each other's countries without a visa in the same way, you know, Australians and New Zealanders can, or people in the European Union can. You could never in a million years imagine any American administration giving that to Mexico, but you know, I think it's easy to imagine Canadians getting it.
Why? Why do you think that? Why do you think that is, JJ?
Well, because I think of all of the tensions with immigration and all that, and I mean, like I'm not passing a value judgment here.
Disease at the end of the name. Maybe.
Well, it's like
too many Gutierrez's. You know,
we're just conceding to political reality here, Tim. I mean, I'm not passing a moral judgment, but you know,
I'm just teasing you. No, it's obviously true. And it's related to immigration. It's also related to racism, and it's related to just, I think, also economic, just realities. Like Canada is more closely an economic peer, and like the types of work that is being done cross border. I'm intrigued by that. I got some bad news for you. I think that's a great idea, actually, for Canada. But the problem is that Trump is not actually going to sign any new trade deals. All right, because you know, like that is going to require him having a proactive desire for, for a global exchange, a cross-border exchange, and he doesn't really. He just wants to tear shit down and talk about how things are bad. And so
you don't think he'd like a big flashy signing ceremony with Lil Marco and all the other characters?
Yeah, up in Ottawa with some Mounties behind them.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's unlikely. I hear you, but I think that is unlikely, and I think that the particulars would be probably pretty challenging to negotiate, and they'd probably end up being pretty unfair to Canada. I just think that there are a lot of real challenges. Though the appeal of getting out of the Mexico part of the deal, and doing nativist appeals on that definitely would appeal to Trump. So talking about it, I think, is a good idea. Actually doing it, I wouldn't get your hopes up. Wow. I'm for you though. I'm with you. I wish we could have a YouTube exchange without visas, where you could just go from Vancouver down to Seattle and back and forth. That makes sense. It's obvious.
Yeah,
I'm skeptical.
Well, I mean, the fact is that Canadians need to come up with something, right? Like we need to come up with some sort of strategy to win Trump over, and I think also just in our own kind of self-interested way, something to get our economy back on track. The tariffs are going to be very destructive to the Canadian economy, but it's not like, we were sitting pretty to begin with. And that's, why Trudeau is going to be losing his bid for a fourth term in the first place.
Woof. Okay. JJ, thank you so much. Our informal Canadian correspondent. I've been wanting to have you on the channel for a long time. We have so much other stuff we could talk about another day. But for folks who, care about Canada, care about pop culture, care about talk to us about some of your little guys behind you.
Some of my little trinkets and baubles. I have like my Japanese takoyaki banner that I got over there. I have a Ulysses S. Grant wood folk art carving. I have a Daruma doll Russian vodka bottle. I've got it all, baby.
So much interesting stuff, Chachis. I think I came across JJ originally over flags. Deep vexicology. Is that vexology?
Yeah,
what do you say?
Vexillology.
I think I first came across you in the flag department. So go check out his feed. It is amazing. Go subscribe. We'll be having him back soon. JJ McCullough, thank you so much. We'll put the link in the description there. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me. See you.